Hey guys, and welcome to MintCast, the official podcast of MintPress News. We're an independent online news service dedicated to watchdog journalism that holds the powerful to account, exposing the money interests that influence policies right here at home and abroad, while we go behind the headlines to bring you the stories the corporate mainstream media doesn't want you to hear. I'm your host, Mnar Muhawesh, founder and editor-in-chief of MintPress News.
And I'm your co-host, Whitney Webb, and together we will not only discuss and analyze the biggest stories that the government and their media lapdogs want swept under the rug, but also interview dissenting voices, independent researchers, and journalists who the establishment would rather silence. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Vanessa Beeley, MintPress News' official correspondent based in Damascus, Syria. Beeley is well known in independent media for her expertise on the Syrian conflict and particularly the covert involvement of Western powers in the crisis through quote-unquote humanitarian front groups. She has recently been covering the conflict in Syria's Idlib province, where groups directly linked to al-Qaeda are fighting to maintain control of the province with the direct backing of Turkey, while the Syrian military seeks to reclaim its territory. Recent developments in the conflict have seen Russia and Turkey negotiate a ceasefire of sorts after Syria and Turkey nearly went to war over Turkey's backing of Idlib militants as the Syrian military, backed by Russia, pushed forward. Despite the ceasefire, Turkey continues to lobby NATO, the EU, and the US to support their efforts to halt the Syrian advance in Idlib with limited success.
Turkish President Recep Erdogan is so desperate for EU support for his military incursion in northern Syria that the Turkish state is effectively weaponizing refugees as leverage to induce European states to take Turkey's position in Syria. This has resulted in millions of Syrian and Afghan refugees to flood Europe after Turkey opened up its borders with the EU. But it was in 2011 when Turkey initially opened its borders to Idlib, where the current crisis was born, setting the stage up for the rise of al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. These terror groups viciously took control of this northern region, which became ground zero for geopolitical interests between Turkish and Western-backed armed terrorists linked to al-Qaeda and the Syrian military trying to retake control of Syria's most resource-rich region. The fight for oil, gas, and major water reservoirs has left civilians scrambling for survival. Now, this crisis created a parallel state with the support of Turkey, Gulf Arab states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and Western nations, including France, Britain, and the United States, who poured millions of dollars and hundreds of tons worth of weapons into the hands of these terror groups in a desperate attempt to overthrow the Syrian government. In what was being described for years by Western media as a bastion of democracy and revolution to justify support for these so-called moderates, Idlib soon became the largest safe haven for al-Qaeda since 9/11. To help us unpack the crisis in Idlib, its significance, and where the Syrian crisis is now, we are joined by Vanessa Beeley. Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me on. It's really good to be on with both of you.
Now, civilians in Idlib continue to be tugged back and forth between being brutalized by Turkish and Western-backed al-Qaeda forces and Turkish warplanes, despite ongoing negotiations between Turkey and Russia to de-escalate the situation. Can you explain what the negotiations between Russia and Turkey are about, and if it will help bring any relief to the civilians caught in this regional proxy war or serve the interests of Turkey and Russia?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to make the point that yes, of course, civilians are caught up in this war, but that this is a defensive war. It's not an offensive war by the Syrian Arab Army and its allies to basically cleanse Syria of foreign mercenaries, extremist groups and factions that have been financed and armed by up to 80 hostile states, including, of course, NATO state members. Turkey is a NATO member state, of course, we shouldn't forget that. And basically what has been happening is Idlib is the final province, as you said, which is the greatest al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. This has also been confirmed more recently by another CENTCOM or an ISIS campaign spokesperson on Twitter about 2 weeks ago, where he stated that it is largely populated by al-Qaeda and that al-Qaeda itself is the greatest threat to civilians in Idlib. So what we're seeing is the Syrian and Russian teams setting up humanitarian corridors to enable civilians to leave safely from the various conflict zones as they move northwards and to the west of Idlib as the army is advancing towards full liberation. And those humanitarian corridors are not being used simply because the terrorist groups are shelling civilians trying to leave. They're sniping them. They're laying mines in the corridors themselves, in the roads that are being used. I visited 3 of the corridors in Idlib, and I've heard stories from civilians that have managed to leave of these events happening to prevent them leaving. Why? Because the civilians have great value as human shields for the terrorist groups, for the extremist groups. Then, of course, if they are trying to leave, they're also being charged extortionate amounts of money by the armed groups who run a sort of mafia gang warfare situation in Idlib. We see often the rebranding of the groups. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is the new name for Nusra Front in Idlib, but it still has its ideology and its roots and its origins in Al-Qaeda. So basically what we're seeing is this campaign to liberate Idlib from the clutches of these terrorist groups. We're seeing all efforts being made by the Syrian government and its allies to enable civilians to leave the areas. We're seeing the terrorists, which are largely controlled by Turkey, by Erdogan, preventing them leaving. And then, of course, creating a situation where they're having to be displaced towards the north because they can't use the humanitarian corridors that would take them towards the south or to the east towards government-held areas. And so that, of course, is creating the situation where Erdogan is then claiming that the Syrian government is forcing people to leave and to head towards Turkey. Of course, when we look at it realistically and rationally, Turkey is the one who has incubated many of these armed groups, allowed them to enter Syria through the porous Turkish borders, and then is arming, equipping, and reinforcing the groups, not only with weapons, but also with Turkish military. Certainly, we've seen a buildup of Turkish troops in the last 2 months. And when I actually went to Sarakeb, the first time it was liberated, so about 2 weeks ago now, we passed around 4 or 5 brand new Turkish so-called observation points, which are in fact military points where they're building up both troops, weapons, armored vehicles, and providing support and cover for the terrorist groups. So, you know, what we're really seeing is the Syrian Arab Army and allies attempting to push forward for a final liberation of Syrian territory from terrorist occupation, terrorists that are being power multiplied, are being reinforced, equipped, and armed by a NATO member state, which is Turkey, and supported, of course, although perhaps not as overtly as Erdogan would like, by other NATO member states. The ceasefire agreement came after, as you rightly said, an escalation, and in fact, an escalation to war. We can't describe it any other way, where the Syrian Arab Army and Turkey were clashing inside Idlib after Erdogan had increased the number of Turkish troops, increased the number of armored convoys coming in, had enabled the terrorist groups to down, I think it was 3 Syrian warplanes, to target Russian warplanes and to target the Syrian Arab Army front lines holding Sarakeb. Sarakeb is pivotal to this battle because it's basically the junction of the M5, which goes from Aleppo to Damascus, and the M4, which goes from Sarakeb to Latakia, to the coast. These 2 roads were, of course, supposed to have been liberated under the Sochi Agreement in September 2018 between Turkey and Russia. The terrorist groups were supposed to have removed all heavy weapons. Al-Qaeda was supposed to have moved out of the deconfliction zone, and these arterial roads were supposed to have been freed up. Of course, that was not achieved. Turkey instead used the Sochi Agreement, as I said, to reinforce the terrorist groups and to install its own military points in strategic areas in Idlib. And so what we saw was an uptick in Turkish aggression just prior to the meeting with Putin to retake this important juncture, the intersection of the M4 and the M5, and to put it back under control of Turkish proxies. And at this point, Turkey was using, Erdogan was using UAVs, drones, heavily armed drones to attack the Syrian Arab Army lines, which at this point pulled back until they could bring in their air defense systems to basically protect themselves against an air attack. And at this point, then we had the ceasefire agreement. Now, the ceasefire agreement itself has actually played very much to the advantage of the Syrian Arab Army. Why? Because it hasn't gone back to the Sochi agreement deconfliction lines. It's enabled the Syrian army to maintain the advances that it had made prior to the ceasefire agreement. It's actually released the M4. It's created a deconfliction zone either side of the M4, I think 6 kilometers either side. And that will be basically patrolled by Russia and Turkey, but most importantly by Russia. So fundamentally, the M4 has been liberated without further bloodshed on behalf of the Syrian Arab Army. Sarakeb is now secured. So the M5 is again open, the Aleppo to Damascus road. And the Syrian Arab Army has the right now to continue advancing against Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, against al-Qaeda and all affiliated groups. So we're in an interesting situation now where those armed groups are actually pretty much mingled in among the Turkish military bases. So what will be interesting to see is as the Syrian Arab Army now advances, as I said, they're only 8 kilometers from Idlib city and only a few kilometers from Salmin, which is sort of in between the two, is whether, again, we're going to see clashes between Turkish troops on the ground and Syrian Arab Army, and then what will happen regarding the agreement, regarding Erdogan's reactions, and of course, regarding whether Russia will ally itself very firmly with Syria, or whether it will still, to some degree, try to protect its trade relations with Turkey.
So oil has long been one of several factors that explains why so many foreign states have been involved in the Syrian conflict since it began. And just this week, we saw Turkish President Erdogan say that he is pushing to, quote unquote, jointly manage Syrian oil fields as part of his recent negotiations over the conflict in Syria with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Do you think this is an attempt by Erdogan to follow Trump's lead to illegally, quote unquote, take the oil in Syria, or an attempt to legitimize Turkey's longstanding clandestine role in the illegal smuggling of Syrian oil?
Yeah, it's kind of Erdogan is such a rogue element in this war. It's quite incredible. I mean, I see him very much like a kind of mafia boss. He plays both ends against the middle. He plays the US off against Russia. We know that Russia has been trying to uncouple Turkey from NATO, to bring it more not into the non-aligned axis. I mean, that isn't going to happen, but at least to bring it more in the sphere of Russia's influence rather than America's influence. And so Erdogan is very much playing one off against the other. And of course, he's talking, as you said, about using it's quite incredible, really, how he's stated this. He's basically said, look, if we have control of the oil export revenue, which I think is around 8 billion, and of course, he's going to wrest that from his nemesis, which is the SDF, the Kurds, which is another, or the Kurdish separatists, which are, of course, another American proxy on occupying sovereign Syrian territory. And what he's talking about is using the income from the oil revenue to rebuild Syria. And he's proposing this apparently to Putin, and he's claiming that Putin has sort of said, well, it's possible. I mean, that's ridiculous in itself, because Putin would never agree to something that basically challenges Syrian territory and Syrian resources without discussion with Damascus. And this is a very important point to make. This entire ceasefire agreement couldn't have happened without Putin's negotiation with Damascus. And then basically he's offering the same deal to Trump. So as I said, he's sort of playing both ends off against the middle. He's trying to squeeze the Kurdish factions out of the equation. And he's trying basically to Ottomanize Syria. I mean, if we look at what he's doing in the northeast, he's basically come into what is effectively a buffer zone in the northeast, and he's occupied it with his proxy militants, which of course were brought over from Idlib to carry out this campaign. And then in Idlib, he's also talking about a 25 to 30 kilometer buffer zone on the borders. He's already installed briquette housing units, 1,500 units. He's supplying electricity. We know that he's supplying SIM cards, for example, to the armed groups. So he's clearly clandestinely occupying and annexing Syrian territory. And then basically this extraordinary claim that he will use Syrian oil revenue to rebuild Syria instead of, the oil should be given back to Syria for Syria to rebuild Syria. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation. And it's a very difficult one to untangle. But Erdogan is, we know that he has this sort of Ottoman emperor agenda inside Syria. We know also that he's coordinating with Israel despite his claims of enmity towards Israel. But we've seen a number of occasions where Israeli attacks on Syria have been coordinated with Turkish increase or escalated aggression against the Syrian Arab army. So we know that there is at least a large degree of collaboration and coordination between Israel and Turkey.
And Vanessa, perhaps most unsurprisingly, I should say, is we've seen allegations from the Idlib terrorists and their supporters that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons in the offensive, with claims this time involving no evidence of an actual attack, but intercepted communications that Western officials think might mean that Syrian soldiers could have used chemical weapons. I know. How does this attempt to accuse the Syrian government of chemical weapons use this time differ from previous accusations of a similar nature? And what reactions from inside Syria to those claims have you noticed, if any?
Well, inside Syria, the chemical weapon claims are just risible. Nobody takes them very seriously. But I think a very important point to make here is that the Syrian Arab army could not advance as rapidly and as efficiently as it has done in Idlib and in the suburbs of Aleppo and the countryside of Aleppo without intelligence from civilians in the occupied areas. And this is something, of course, that mainstream media is never going to talk about. But civilians that are actually trapped in areas that are being defended by the terrorist groups are providing intelligence to the Syrian army, telling them, for example, where their underground headquarters are, where their ammunition depots are, so that the army and the air force can most systematically target those areas and target the terrorist areas while informing the civilians of the attacks, so the civilians can take cover. Basically, that's the system. And the same civilians are providing information of these staging of chemical weapon events. Now, I've previously interviewed families who've had their children abducted by the terrorist groups and by the White Helmets. This is based on testimony from civilians. And they know also from information being fed to them by families still in Idlib, because many of these were refugees from Idlib that are now living in Aleppo, or they're living in Mnar and the surrounding areas. They're receiving information that their children have been sighted in different areas. So the children are being moved around, we have to presume, for staged chemical weapon attacks. Now, of course, the kind of extraordinariness of this narrative is not so extraordinary now that we know that the Duma attack was staged. We know that thanks to independent analysts and experts who formed part of the OPCW inspection team, and who have now sort of rebelled against the corruption and manipulation of that report to justify France, UK, and US aggression, unlawful aggression shortly after the alleged Duma attack. We know now that that attack was staged. The questions have been raised on many levels as to who then were the victims of that alleged and now discredited chemical attack, who murdered the children, who used them as props and rearranged their bodies. Now we're hearing that children are being moved around to different zones to be used in a staging of a chemical attack to try and stop the Syrian Arab Army advances, as of course we've seen in every single liberation campaign. Chemical weapon attacks are kind of, the red flag that is supposed to then escalate outrage from the international community, criminalize the Syrian government, and halt the Syrian Arab Army advances and protect the terrorist groups. So we know that the chemical weapon attacks are kind of the Syrian dodgy dossier, the Syrian weapons of mass destruction. And so people here are sort of just raise their eyebrows whenever they hear that there's potential of a chemical attack. One, because Syria doesn't have chemical weapons. It destroyed them in 2013, 2014, which was overseen by the OPCW itself. The chemical weapon facility that was bombed allegedly after the Duma alleged chemical attack was in fact a cancer research laboratory. This entire narrative has fallen apart at the seams, and it's a sign of the desperation, not only of the armed groups and groups like the White Helmets, who of course have been responsible for the production of this propaganda, since their establishment in 2013, but also desperation of the US coalition of destabilization that has been waging this war against Syria for now 9 years.
So, speaking of the White Helmets, you, of course, have done the most extensive reporting on this group over the course of the Syrian conflict. And as you say, this group has resurfaced again during the Idlib offensive, with their leader calling for a no-fly zone and an effort to prevent the Syrian army from advancing, while other members of the group have accused Syria of bombing civilian infrastructure, among other things. So for our listeners that maybe don't know, why are the White Helmets not a credible source of information in your opinion, and what are they currently doing in Idlib?
Well, I mean, the White Helmets are not credible because, to put it very mildly, they're heavily compromised. I mean, it's a group that was established in Turkey and in Jordan by a former British military intelligence operative who died under very mysterious circumstances in November last year, James Le Mesurier. And basically, this group, the White Helmets, are embedded exclusively with the armed and extremist groups headed up and dominated by Al-Qaeda. We've proven over time that many of the leaders of various groups of the White Helmets in different geographical locations are Al-Qaeda members or members of some of the more sectarian extremist armed groups. They have very clear links to criminal armed groups that have carried out executions, decapitation of children, for example, Nur al-Zinki in July 2016, when they decapitated the 12-year-old Palestinian child, Abdullah Isa. And the White Helmets provide cover, basically. They provide a sort of humanitarian, in inverted commas, veneer for the terrorist groups. They provide protection, and they provide the narratives that both whitewash the terrorist groups, basically revise history. We've seen a number of movies, of course, made featuring the White Helmets that basically reduce the narrative down to bad Assad, good rebels, and totally erase Nusra Front or the terrorist groups from our consciousness. What I've seen very recently, and of course it's a repeat of what I've seen elsewhere in Syria, is in Idlib and in West Aleppo, in the liberated areas, I have found White Helmet centers next door to Nusra Front centers, sharing facilities with Nusra Front, with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, with Nur al-Zinki, as I said, a formerly US-funded armed group that beheaded Abdullah Isa in 2016. We see their signs everywhere, on lampposts, on buildings, next to bomb factories. We found one center which looked very much like a training center for White Helmets that also had, as part of the complex, a sort of small chemical weapons lab where we found a number of chemical ingredients. We found rockets that we presume would be packed full of the chemical ingredients, and a number of other kind of explosives and very similar to dime tungsten dust, which is packed into the missiles, and then when it explodes, it causes terrible mutilation and septicemia in the people that are wounded by it. And so, we see it time and time again that these white helmet operatives, these groups, move with the terrorist groups. So in other words, when the areas are liberated, they don't stay behind to help civilians. They basically move on to the new front line with Al-Qaeda and affiliated groups. And, their evidence and their testimony has been discredited, as I said, by the exposure of the OPCW corruption over the Douma alleged chemical attack. But not only that, the cries of hospitals being destroyed. I've visited now a number of towns and villages in Idlib, and I've visited all the hospitals that I could visit. Some, of course, are closer to front lines and are a bit more dangerous to go and see, but I will hopefully be seeing them in the near future. But the ones that I have visited, okay, they may have some sort of external damage, but they were still operating as hospitals up until the time that the terrorists left. And again, this is a repetition of what I saw in Eastern Ghouta, what I saw in East Aleppo, and what I saw in the south. The white helmets effectively produce propaganda that corroborates the foreign policy of the governments that are funding them. And a no-fly zone, as we know, is tantamount to a declaration of war. So this so-called neutral humanitarian group is a very politicized group. It affiliates itself to all of the sectarian groups, predominantly Free Syrian Army, but also Al-Qaeda. And it is a sectarian group. It contains none of the minority communities from Syria's secular society. And it is a very exclusive group. It basically, as I said, is made up of extremist sectarian elements.
Now, beyond Turkey's obvious role in the fight for Idlib, another nation state is also covertly attacking Syria, sometimes out in the open, but of course media doesn't cover it as much, which is the state of Israel. Israel recently bombed Syria in coordination with Turkey, which may seem really odd to some, given Erdogan's public claims of support for Palestine and oppose the policies of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I know you touched on this briefly before, earlier, but if you can, talk more about the Turkish-Israeli relations with respect to the Syrian conflict, and more specifically in relation to the current fight for Idlib.
Well, of course, Turkey has benefited. I think Whitney touched on it a bit earlier. Turkey has benefited from the sale of Syrian oil to Israel. And I believe it was actually Erdogan's son who was heavily involved in that. And so, therefore, the relations between Turkey and Israel, while, as you rightly say, Turkey or Erdogan likes to portray himself as the Sultan of the Muslim Brotherhood. So in other words, yes, he does extend support towards Gaza in particular. I know that he's offered educational sponsorship for students from Gaza, for example, in the past and up until recent days. But that is simply because he's harnessing, if you like, the support of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is my theory, through his support of Palestine, which gives him a very powerful backing. We saw how powerful that was when he was under threat from the coup in 2016, and when he called to his aid the Muslim Brotherhood factions in Turkey, who pushed back against any kind of uprising against him. And then, of course, we saw the systematic imprisonment, torture, suppression of any voices against him, both within media and academia, etc. And you're quite right in the sense that we've seen it probably most blatantly in the Idlib operation, where, for example, when Erdogan was increasing the attacks on Sarakeb, on the Syrian Arab Army lines, to the point where Hezbollah and Iranian troops had to come in large numbers to reinforce the Syrian Arab Army lines at that point to hold Sarakeb. At the same time, the same night, Israel targeted the air defense systems in Homs, the Syrian air defense systems in Homs. Now, the missiles didn't hit target, but it was very clear that what Israel was trying to do was to knock out the Syrian air defense to enable Turkey to inflict the most damage possible with the drones and the UAVs that he was using at that point in his aggression. And previously, of course, when Turkey first started to really come across the border and to invade Syria, we saw again Israeli helicopters coming into Syrian airspace in the south in Quneitra, and I think 3 Syrian soldiers at that point were injured. But there's a really important point that I want to make here as well. In the last couple of days, an SAS operative, a British SAS operative, was flown out of southern Syria, first of all to the Al Tanf American base to the southeast, close to the border with Jordan, and then to Iraq. Now, what we've seen here in Syria in the last few weeks, and I've witnessed it myself here in Damascus, is a sudden spate of car explosions, car IED explosions, and a number of martyrs during these explosions. A number of assassinations, one of an Iranian Quds Forces commander only a few days ago in Sayyida Zainab, which of course is the heart of a Shia Muslim pilgrimage here in Damascus. So we've seen a number of sort of clandestine, what I would call intelligence operations going on here. We know that there are now a number of ISIS operatives that have re-entered Dara. We know that there are calls for further attacks on the Syrian government and on the capital from armed groups still existing within the Dara city and Dara countryside. So there is a sense of the British and probably Israel, who had control, of course, over many of the southern armed groups. They were providing not only arms but hospital treatment for these groups, perhaps stoking another kind of front in the south to try and distract the Syrian military from the northwest, from Idlib. So it's a very strong possibility that at this point Israel and Turkey are definitely working in coordination, but not only those two, British intelligence, American intelligence, because we can't forget that Rukban camp, which is ostensibly a refugee camp, which is just to the south of the Al Tanf military base, American base, is effectively a recruitment and training center for Al Qaeda and even ISIS. ISIS received protection from America, of course, within a 25, I think it's a 25, maybe 50-kilometer radius around Al Tanf. The Syrian Arab Army and Russia are not allowed to enter that area without American permission. So it's an extraordinary situation at the moment. And Syria is yet again facing, in my view, at least a two-front battle. One may not be as intense as the northwestern Idlib battle, but certainly I believe there are intelligence operations going on in the south to try and stir up problems that will distract the army from the northwest.
Well, shifting gears a little bit now, you recently, in addition to your reporting on the Syrian conflict, you recently interviewed Yemen's ambassador to Syria in Damascus about the Saudi and Emirati-led war in Yemen. And during that interview, one thing that came up was Israel's very underreported role in that conflict as well. Could you give a brief overview of Israel's involvement in Yemen?
Yeah,
and
sure. I mean, it was
war?
really interesting. I'd had an idea, or certainly a good idea, that Israel was involved, but in a rather clandestine way, let's say. But what the Yemeni ambassador made very clear is that Israel has been involved in the military aggressions against Yemen from the beginning. Israeli pilots, he claims, were made up part of the Saudi coalition and were providing expertise and military advice to the Saudi coalition. He made the point, and of course this has been made previously by a number of analysts, that the greatest fear for Israel is that what they perceive to be the Iranian crescent, which is, in their view, expanding very successfully in the northern crescent, so in Iraq and in Syria, for example, that this might extend, as they perceive it, to Yemen, because, of course, the Ansarullah popular resistance movement is perceived or portrayed very much in the West in allegiance with the Saudi coalition as being an Iranian proxy, which is not entirely true. And Israel is terrified that then Iranian influence will expand into an area which for them is strategically or geostrategically so important, because that would give Iran, in their view, control over not only, as it has already, the Hormuz Straits to the east of Yemen, but also the Bab el-Mandeb Straits to the west of Yemen. And we have to remember that Israel has a stronghold in Djibouti, on the Horn of Africa, which of course is on the Bab el-Mandeb Straits. So the last thing that they want to see is Iran increasing or expanding its influence into Yemen. And so therefore it's coming in to support the Saudi Arabian alliance to try and prevent this happening. And it's a very important factor in this, because of course the Yemeni resistance is fighting very much alone in Yemen. It doesn't have the diplomatic and political or military support of Russia or even Iran to such a large extent as Syria has. And the Israeli involvement is, of course, strengthening the Saudi alliance.
Switching back to Syria, as Syria has advanced in Idlib, reports have surfaced regarding the movements of Turkish-backed terrorists from Idlib to Libya. How does this reflect the long-standing link between the Libyan and Syrian conflicts in terms of the flow of weapons and fighters and funds and so on?
So what we're seeing now is a sort of rapprochement between Libya and Syria, which is a pretty interesting development because, as you rightly said, many of the weapons and even the terrorists came in from the Libyan side at the beginning of the conflict. So now if we see a sort of a coming together of Libya and Syria, then this could create another element to the non-aligned resistance axis that we're seeing develop, of course, as a result of the war against Syria. We're seeing a regional unity that we've probably not seen before. I mean, we've seen it after the assassination by America of Qasem Soleimani and Mohandes, the leader of al-Hashd al-Shabi. In Iraq, we've seen Iraq calling for the departure of the US troops in Iraq and the end of the US neo-colonialist occupation of Iraq. So although things are still looking very precarious, I do believe there is an optimism for the future. And I do think we're seeing the unification of Arab states that we perhaps wouldn't have seen if Syria had not resisted this project as long as it has, with enormous sacrifice on behalf of the Syrian Arab Army and the Syrian people, who, of course, are being collectively punished not only by the war itself, but by economic terrorism, by illegal economic sanctions that are collectively punishing the Syrian people for their resistance against the US coalition project here. And so what I do think we're seeing is a very strong reaction against US-led neocolonialism. And I think that was also touched on by the Yemeni ambassador, in the sense that he said now the non-aligned axis is becoming actually very powerful, although they are all under pressure, although they are all on the front lines against imperialism. They are effectively uniting. I mean, I'm seeing it here. I'm seeing the Cuban ambassadors and the Venezuelan ambassadors and even the South African ambassadors, uniting together to support Syria and to try and sort of find ways to bypass the sanctions, to try and find ways to increase trade despite sanctions on virtually all these countries. And so it's a sort of very transformational time that we're going through. It's also a very painful time for many people. I mean, somebody said to me very recently in Aleppo, they said, this war has not only scarred us in many, many ways structurally, it's attacked our culture, it's attacked our history, our heritage, But every single person in Syria, and these were his words, he says, has aged 100 years because of this war, and has aged 1,000 years emotionally and spiritually because of this war. And I think, the human side of these campaigns of this military adventurism is often not discussed. It's often, we spend our time talking about the geopolitical analysis, and we kind of forget about the human toll of these wars on the civilians in these countries who are doing their best to cope with conditions that are being forced upon them. For what? I mean, none of them, they all still support the Syrian government. They still support their self-determination. They still support their secular state. And if President Assad were to leave tomorrow, the Syrian people would keep fighting against extremism, against terrorism, against being pulled back into the dark ages and having their progressive nature stunted by something that's being imposed upon them by our governments. Sorry, that digressed a bit from Libya.
No, actually, I thought it was really great and insightful, and that's why it's just so great to have your perspective, because you're on the ground in Syria talking to real Syrians who have direct experiences with the conflict, unlike a lot of Western mainstream media pundits that sort of pontificate from their couches and studios. So anyway, this is going to be our last question because we just have a couple minutes left. But as a lot of longtime MintPress readers will know, relatively recently, high-ranking U.S. officials openly admitted that Idlib was the largest safe haven for al-Qaeda since the September 11th attacks. Yet the U.S. are backing Turkey's efforts to protect this al-Qaeda enclave. So briefly, what does this say to you about U.S. foreign policy and its war on terror?
Well, I mean, I think since the war on terror was ignited, let's say by 9/11, I think we've seen an exponential increase in global terror, and I think that speaks volumes in itself. But I think, wherever we look in the world, whatever moniker the armed groups or the terrorist extremist groups are given, their origins are in the financing and funding of these groups by not only by the US, but by the intelligence agencies of a number of the members of the US coalition, including, of course, so basically what we're saying is American foreign policy, UK foreign policy, EU foreign policy is effectively to support, promote, sponsor, and endorse terrorism while claiming to be fighting terrorism. I mean, this is the ultimate hypocrisy of our age, in my opinion. And I think what is very important, I mean, Muammar Gaddafi warned us of this fact. He warned us of the backlash of this policy. We've seen it already. We've seen terrorist attacks in France mainland. We've seen terrorist attacks in UK mainland. But the public need to be very aware that the terrorist groups that are committing atrocities inside Syria, for example, are not called terrorists by our state-aligned media outlets. They're called rebels or Democrats or local councils or civil society, but they are not called terrorists. They are only called terrorists when they come onto our soil and commit the same atrocities against our own people. And I think what we need to start doing is to connecting ourselves to the people that are being punished and being attacked and being massacred and sacrificing themselves to defend themselves against the terrorism that is being produced by our governments before it does come back onto our soil, because it is going to come back. We can't be producing terrorism. We can't be feeding terrorism to the extent that we are, that our governments are, and then not expect there to be some kind of repercussion. And I think this is what it's so important to explain this to people. What Syria is doing is a service to all of us, because what it's doing is containing those terrorist elements inside its borders, and it is defeating them inside its borders. If Syria fails in its defense of its homeland, in other words, if our governments overwhelm Syria and its allies, then actually I don't even want to think of the repercussions of that, not only for the region and in particular for Palestine. I mean, Syria is is the strongest defender of Palestine in the region. If Syria falls, there will be no Palestine. And this is something we need to digest very, very, very carefully.
And it's interesting how Israel has played such a role in Western media and even in Arab media, and also, Turkish influence, and kind of flipping that narrative to demonize countries that, stand up for Palestine, demonize countries like Iran and Syria, and, spread that sectarianism. It's the cynical reality of war and propaganda. Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us today. I learned so much, and I know that our listeners will, learn so much from this podcast. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. It was really nice to be talking to both of you.
That's a wrap for today's MintCast podcast. This program is 100% listener supported. You can join the hundreds of financial sponsors who make this show possible by becoming a member on our Patreon page. We'll see you next week.